It's the invitational nature of reality. Everything is always inviting you out and seeming to say, can you take this? Are you large enough for it? As we go through an individual life, the existence seems to say, can you take this loss? And now can you take this loss? Can you take this grief? Are you big enough? And eventually we're asked to say goodbye to it all.
Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. I don't know if you've ever been in this situation where you've been in a kind of dark night of the soul, difficult time in your life, and there's been a voice that has helped you through it, including a voice maybe that you didn't even know, but that you could hear from afar. For me, that was a poet by the name of David Whyte. I heard for the first time almost a decade ago doing an interview with Krista Tippett on the program On Being. And he read several of his poems there and talked about them. And I immediately went and found them, found every one I could find, both audio and in print. And they became embedded in my life at that time. There was one in particular that said this: sometimes, with the bones of the black sticks left when the fire has gone out, someone has written something new in the ashes of your life. You are not leaving, even as the light fades quickly now. You are arriving. I needed to hear that in what I consider to be the black ashes of my life at that point. And that's why I am thrilled to have David Whyte with us today, renowned poet, speaker, author, and someone who came to poetry an unusual way through marine biology, leading for a time expeditions in the Galapagos Islands and the Andes, and the Amazon and the Himalayas and other places. He has written many collections of poetry as well as prose volumes. Pilgrim is one that I particularly love. The House of Belonging is another. And there are two collections, and the newest one has just come out, Consolations, and now Consolations 2, The Solace, Nourishment, and Underlying Meaning of Everyday Words. We're going to be talking about some of those words. So don't be intimidated by poetry if you don't feel like you know enough about poetry, because we're going to be talking about things such as anxiety and burnout and despair and joy and hope. And so, David Whyte, thanks so much for being with us today.
Pleasure to talk with you, Russell. Yeah.
You were a marine biologist in the Galapagos Islands. How did you become one of the most respected and preeminent poets alive today? That's not the way most people get there.
You're very kind assessing my career. So such a flattering way. Actually, Russell, I've written since I was 7 years old or so. And I was very moved by my Irish mother's repertoire of poetry and stories in Irish and in English. And I early on I saw poetry as a secret code to existence, to life, really. And my own way in. So I started writing poetry myself when I was 7 years old or so. And then I took it on really seriously when I was 13 as a very serious young man in the north of England. And then I was beautifully distracted by Jacques Cousteau sailing on his ship Calypso, following the life of the dolphin. And I conceived a notion to do the same myself. And I always knew I could read poetry myself, but I wouldn't be able to pick up a book on ecological genetics and make my way through it. So I needed some help. So I put myself into into the salt mines of biology, chemistry, and physics, and then went off and did a degree in marine zoology. And then, through an astonishing set of circumstances and a lot of luck of the Irish, I found myself in the Galapagos Islands as a naturalist guide, a guia naturalista, as it's called in Ecuadorian Spanish there. And so I was 2 years there. And it was after I left Galapagos that I started to transist slowly back to my first love of poetry. And I went full time as a poet when I was 32 years old. And it's been quite a few decades since that I've been working with it. But I've always memorized poetry. And so I've always had a repertoire of memorized poems. And it used to be mostly other people's. And now I have hundreds of my own poems too. And so I work with them in a kind of extemporaneous way to get into places it's often very difficult to get into when you're trying to talk about the finer qualities of experience. And so a good poem is not about something. It is the thing itself, if it's a good poem. A bad poem's about something, or trying to be about something. A good poem, there's no defenses against the language in it. And, from your point of view, you'll know the poetry in the Psalms and the way that just gets straight through you. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. This is, it's iambic pentameter. It's powerful. It gets right under your skin right away. That's the power of poetry, whether it's in a theological sense or in an everyday conversational sense.
It's interesting that you should bring up the Psalms, because as I was thinking about your poems that have become so embedded in my life, I notice so often biblical allusions and themes. I mean, I can think of Lazarus, the metaphor you use of Lazarus being called forward. And in one of my favorite poems of yours that we'll talk about later, stepping out of the boat and taking the hand of the one belongs in yours. These sorts of allusions to the Bible. Am I just reading that in from my own from my own perspective, or did the poetry of the Bible have an influence on you?
Oh, I was marinated in the Bible when I was a child, and we both had religious instruction at school, in the state schools, and which was at that time was all Christianity. And I loved the stories. And then I went to Sunday school every Sunday morning, walked across the fields with my sisters, and we had great storytellers there. And they'd also given us they gave us these books, and on the left-hand side was the biblical story written, and on the right-hand side was a big empty white square with a black line around it. And if you turned up at the Sunday school, you got your stamp with the given scene, biblical scene, which you then completed your double-page spread with. I remember the stamp, it was as big as your head. It took every last drop of saliva in your system to lick that stamp and then place it in the book. And the sense of arrival and spiritual satisfaction in placing the stamp in that book has been rarely replicated in my adult life. But I often feel that many of those stories are stamped right through me. Moses before the burning bush, turning the water into wine, Martha and Mary with Jesus, and stepping out of the boat towards Peter, stepping out of the boat towards. They just burst out, out of nowhere. So I don't consider myself a Christian poet, but the stories and the images are so powerful inside me. And I don't know if you read my controversial essay on beliefs in Consolations 2, but the first line is quite radical. It says, beliefs are not sacred, only the places from which they arise. Yeah. And so it's the sacredness of your connection that you have, especially as a child, where you see right through things. You have an unmitigated, direct perception of what the story is about, even though you can't articulate it in in with the articulation that you might bring to it later on in your adult life. But the ability to keep the vision, the primary visions of childhood alive and connect them to a mature vocabulary. You could say that this is the art of poetry itself. And it's also the art, you could say it's the essence of religious practice. I had an experience as a child quite often, and I'm sure many children have it, of listening to the adult world and their priorities and how they went about things and thinking to myself, these people are actually insane. You know, they've forgotten the primary priorities of existence. You know, I wouldn't have used that language to describe it. I would have used my own child's language, but that was exactly how I felt, that somehow adulthood was a form of amnesia. And when I discovered really good poetry, adult poetry, I said, "Oh!" I remember pulling down a book of Seamus Heaney and Tom Gunn. No, it was Ted Hughes and Tom Gunn from the top shelf, and it fell into my hands. I just managed to get I was only 13 years old. I hadn't gone through my growth spurt yet. I had to really get up on tiptoe, get my fingers just around the spine, and I pulled it off. It landed in my hands. I opened it up, started reading, and I felt as if I was abducted by a passing hawk. I felt like it flew down, got its claws in me, and carried me off. Yeah. And what I experienced there, I said, "Oh, these are adults who have kept the primary vision of childhood alive. It's possible," I said to myself. And I think that's when I redoubled my application and my apprenticeship to poetry. And luckily, I had great English master, as we called them at that school. It was a very old-fashioned school. And I had a superb education in English letters as well as Latin. And so that's a very concise rendition. So, for instance, in that poem, the image of Lazarus.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have had the image of Lazarus to begin with when I first started. I was simply writing about the incredible impact of poetry. So the first lines are, "Good poetry starts." I've just forgotten the line here. You must be making me nervous, Russell. Good poetry begins with the lightest touch, a breeze arriving from nowhere, a whispered, healing arrival. Then, like a hand in the dark, it arrests the whole body, stealing you for revelation. In the silence that follows a great line, you can feel Lazarus deep inside. Even the laziest, most deathly afraid part of you lift up his hands and walk toward the light. Good poetry begins with the lightest touch, a breeze arriving from nowhere, a whispered, healing arrival. Then, like a hand in the dark, it arrests the whole body, stealing you for revelation. I don't know if you've ever come across a hand in the dark that you didn't know it was there, but if you did, it would be quite startling. And that was a physical experience. Then, like a hand in the dark, it arrests the whole body, stealing you for revelation. In the silence that follows a great line, you can feel Lazarus. And there he is, suddenly out of my childhood, out of that fiery primary experience. You can feel Lazarus deep inside. Even the laziest, most deathly afraid part of you lift up his hands and walk toward the light. When I'd written that line, I had, not only a primary experience of my own afraidness or reluctance to be here in the old incarnatory body, but also I had an image of, oh, that's what Lazarus was afraid of life, and the invitation was back to life, back to drop your fears, and look life straight in the eyes, walk toward the light.
You mentioned this about kind of a recovery of childhood. I think about the words that you use in, I think it's House of Belonging, one of your poems about adult aloneness.
Yes.
Which seems to evoke this sense of an alienation that tends to happen as or a loneliness that tends to happen as people grow into the responsibilities of adulthood. Is that what you're getting at there? Is that there's a a
Yeah.
loneliness that comes with that kind of disconnection.
Well, there's a difference between aloneness and loneliness, and those are
Mm.
two separate words in in my first Consolations book. Yeah, and loneliness always tells you how much you belong, really, and we often calibrate the measure of our belonging in an inverse way. Often in a marriage or relationship, when you're in the kitchen, you're often calibrating your closeness by how far away you are from each other. And you might even be saying to yourself, oh, we're not too far away from each other
Mm.
today. So aloneness is often the calibration of how much we want to belong. It's a kind of gravitational pull. There was a really remarkable moment in the preaching life of Meister Eckhart, the great Dominican mystic of the 13th century. And he was asked by a parishioner, or someone who must have been in distress at the time, where is God? Where is God? Everyone asks that question, even if you don't believe in God. You say, where is God here in this? Yeah. And Eckhart said, nowhere. It's a really powerful answer. He must have thought that the person could actually understand what he was saying. Nowhere, God is pure absence. Yeah. And what he meant that was we often have our relationship with the deity or with what is most precious along a gravitational field of distance and exile. Yeah. But that that sense of exile can actually bring you really close. It sets you off on the road. Yeah. And there's no other step you can take than the step from where you actually are in your life, even if it's that is in darkness and distance, yeah, and aloneness. Yeah.
Mm.
So loneliness, is well, in the Zen tradition, they'd say it was a delusion along the way that you're that there's nothing else helping you. Yeah. So it's just a temporary delusion that we go through in order to understand how much we're in conversation with everything else all the time. Yeah.
I,
And then being alone is absolutely necessary. I always remember having a great old conversation with John O'Donoghue, who was a great kind of Irish and theologian. And I remember having a conversation. We were in a pub in the west of Ireland, and we were talking about the irredeemable aloneness of an individual, and at the same time, the irredeemable togetherness,
mm,
and that we don't get to choose between them, and that every human life is a conversation between, as I say in another poem, singing a separate self and learning to be selfless. Yeah.
mm,
Singing a separate self and learning to be selfless. We're all in that really difficult
mm.
conversation and rewarding conversation too.
I thought about you immediately as I was reading philosopher Charles Taylor's newest book, Cosmic Connections, where he's
Mm,
talking about the fact that one of the problems of late modernity is that nothing seems to speak to us. That everything seems to be dead, seems to be mastered, and then to be dead, and that
mm,
part of what people long for is a kind of conversation with the cosmos, a connection that it
yeah,
speaks where deep calls into to deep. And I thought about so many of your poems that talk about that conversation and also the invitation, this sense
yeah,
of calling. I mean, many of the poems, and especially at the worst part of my life, the ones that really spoke to me were the ones that talked about stepping out in response to this kind of invitation. Scary,
yeah,
don't know where you're going, but you're stepping out.
yeah.
Where in your view is that invitation coming from? Is it simply metaphorical, or how should we think of that? What's actually calling us?
Well, it's in the very marrow of ourselves and the essence of ourselves, both in an imaginative and theological sense, but also in an evolutionary sense. We've grown with the rest of the world. We've grown interacting. We've grown meeting other things. We talk about the cell wall, which is a really unimaginative description of something that is a conversational membrane of exchange. Yeah. And that's been true since we were singular cellular animals. We've gone through this astonishing voyage, staying in conversation with our surroundings all the way through. So we've grown for hundreds of thousands of years with the color blue in the sky. It's a help to us, it's a consolation to us, and it's an invitation out of ourselves. We've grown we've got a dusting of snow on the ground. We've grown with the seasons as they change. Yeah. And we're a different person in the summer than we are in the fall. We're actually holding a different conversation. So I talk about the conversational nature of reality, the fact that you can't establish an identity yourself. It's impossible. Yeah. You're always meeting and being invited by, and sometimes being overwhelmed by, the creation around you. Yeah. So we're always the edge between what we think is us and what we think is not us. Yeah. What you think is you and what you think is not you. That's the only place where things are real, actually, and where you actually meet. So that's the dynamic I talk about when I talk about the conversational nature of reality. But when you think about it, there's never any real conversation unless there's an invitation. When you think about it, in a relationship, in a collegiate relationship at work, in a theological relationship with your God, when the invitation stops, the conversation stops. So it's not only the conversational nature of reality, it's the invitational nature of reality. Everything is always inviting you out and seeming to say, can you take this? Are you large enough for it? As we go through an individual life, the existence seems to say, can you take this loss? And now can you take this loss? Can you take this grief? Are you big enough? And eventually we're asked to say goodbye to it all, and let go of it. And even come to a level of maturity where you may understand that the rest of creation may actually be quite relieved to see you go. And so you can stop taking up all this oxygen, stop repeating yourself, and let something new come through. This is a sign of maturity, actually, to get out of the way. But in the Zen tradition, the understanding is that you don't get enlightened. You pay attention to everything around you that's not you in such a fierce way that it starts to speak back to you in its own enlightened voice. Yeah. And when it comes to find you, it finds someone much fiercer, much more present, much broader, much riskier than the person who started the process of attention. Yeah. And I certainly had that. I had that experience in the Galapagos Islands as a naturalist. I learned to put the world in boxes through my zoological training. We learned the binomial latinate Linnaean system, which is a fancy way of saying the Latin names, the double-barreled Latin names we give for birds and animals. Yeah. And you're under the impression that when you learn that, you know what you're looking at. No, the only thing the Linnaean system did was tell naturalists all across Europe at that time that they were all speaking about the same thing. That's all it told us. And that's often what naming and nomenclature does. Yeah. So we get lazy and stop paying attention to the essence of what lies behind the name. So the essence of Galapagos, after a good few weeks there, started to overwhelm me. And all the boxes and names that I'd been trained, to give it just fell away. And the birds and animals, the ecology, the botanical constellation of qualities all started to speak back to me in their own voice. Yeah. And it's one that wipes away the part of you that wants to name the world too easily. So it's that fire that Moses saw in the bush, and he's not meant to come to any conclusion there. The voice from the bush just says, take off your shoes. Yeah. You're standing on holy ground. Yeah. And I remember sitting in a Zen retreat, actually, and that image coming in to me. In a Zen retreat, you're not supposed to think about these things. But every now and again, you have a lightning raid on something because your insight gets so sharp, sitting hour after hour. And I suddenly realized that when Moses looked down, he realized that not only was he standing on holy ground in that moment, but he had been for every step of his living existence. Yeah. And he was just coming home. Yeah. I had a gorgeous moment in a reading in New York City. Actually, I read that. I read the poem there, it's called "The Opening of Eyes." The last lines are, "It is Moses in the desert, fallen to his knees before the lit bush. It is the man throwing away his shoes as if to enter heaven, and finding himself astonished, opened at last, fallen in love with solid ground." And so I read that piece. It was in New York, and there was a Hasidic student in full regalia, and he came up to me afterwards, so excited. He said, "You know what the line in the original language in the Bible is when God says, 'Take off your shoes'?" I said, "No." He said, "God says, 'Shed your shoes.'"
Hmm.
And it's the same verb as an animal shedding its skin.
Hmm.
So God says, "Shed your shoes." And it's that invitation to shed the layers of our identity at each crucial threshold of transformation in our lives, which is so necessary and so astonishingly cyclical. Yeah.
Hmm.
We take on identities in order to live a certain breadth of our existence. Yeah. And almost always towards the end of that epoch, we get into a process of impersonation. And the impersonation is very subtle because you're actually impersonating yourself.
Huh.
And you can't quite tell, but you're stuck. And so the ability to understand when the season is over and you have to shed your skin. And it's interesting, I spent a lot of time out in the wilds, particularly in Africa. When animals shed their skins, they're not the prettiest. Yeah. The axis of attraction to the rest of the world changes. And in fact, they often have to hide. And underwater, it's especially true with crustaceans. Lobsters, when they shed their skins, they have to stay out of sight while their skins are soft. Yeah. And we have psychologically the same process. Yeah. The necessity to let go of any carapace we've put over, even the most precious things. There's a line by Rilke, the great German-speaking poet, where he's talking about the act of prayer. And, and he says to God, "Our pious hands lay a cover over you whenever we feel you are open towards us. Our pious hands lay a cover over you whenever we feel you are open towards us." So he's looking at how the very act of prayer can be closing over the living essence of what you're trying to contact. Because it's so frightening to us. The essence will always subvert the periphery. And we've so often put all our eggs in the basket of the periphery. The house I live in, the name for my work, how I'm seen by others. Yeah. So this other living flame inside us is much more radical, and it's often that essence and that flame that Jesus was speaking to that was so disturbing to all his disciples. Yeah. Right from the beginning, when he says, leave your jobs and your work. I've got something else for you to work with. Yeah. Make you fishers of men. Yeah. Fishers of men and women. Yeah.
That makes me think of a line in your first Consolations book that stopped me in my tracks, because I was coming to the conclusion that in order for me to be the Christian that I am, I would have to leave the particular church tradition that I had been in all my life, in the ministry that I had built all my life, and go into something new. And I found myself really nostalgic thinking about, and you had a line where you said, nostalgia is not an immersion in the past.
Yes.
I think is the way you put it. Not an immersion in the past, but an enunciation that something is coming to an end.
that the past is, as you know, it is coming to an end. Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah,
And that really transformed the way I was thinking of things. And I
yeah,
thought about it. I thought about it in the new Consolations book in the word burnout,
yeah.
because you're talking about you're talking about burnout in a very different way from anybody I've ever heard talk about it,
Mm,
which is usually, well, you need a break, you need to
yes,
rest, and you're talking about this loss of dreams. And you have this line where you say, the foundation from which we transform the experience of burnout is always the realization that we have been measuring all the wrong things in all the wrong ways, and that we have for too long mismeasured our sense of self in the same way. I think
yeah,
that completely hits at what's happening with so many people
yeah.
that I know, that they think they're burned out, meaning tired, when they're really brokenhearted.
Yes, I had a lovely moment in my life with one of my great teachers, a Benedictine monk called David Stendhal Rast. I don't know if you know his work. He's worked on the whole phenomena of gratefulness and written a book called Gratefulness is the Heart of Prayer. He's in his 90s now, but when he was just a young monk of 60 or so, I remember, or in his 50s, I sat down with him, and I was just coming to ripen around declaring myself as a full-time poet. And as you can imagine, you don't get much corroboration from the world if you, uh, most especially from your father-in-law. You declare you're going full-time as a poet. You meet a lot of silences in your life, but the Buddhistic silence of your father-in-law is beyond all silences you'll ever meet. Yeah. And but you meet the father-in-law silence everywhere. Whenever you are taking a courageous line that you can't fully explain to someone else. Yeah. And I was at the time working at a non-profit that was doing great work in the world, but we were all working in a way that wasn't good for us. We were all getting burned out as that living flame was just being scoured out of us. So you just had the ashes, and I got so exhausted that I had a particular incident that occurred, and I just had to go home. I just realized the depth of my tiredness right through my bones, and I went home, and I realized that evening, I realized because I had a bottle of red wine on the kitchen table that I'd got out, and Brother David and I would always have a glass of red wine while we read German poetry and translated it to each other, because the Benedictines have a long, many centuries old conversation with alcohol, often making it themselves. So we'd have the red wine, we'd sip the red wine, and we'd translate Rilke and have a great old time. And which is he was Austrian, so my German has an Austrian accent now. So but I was so done in that day, so burned out. Yeah. I said to him in a kind of beseeching, Cahill Gibran-like way, I said, Brother David, speak to me of exhaustion. Tell me about exhaustion. And he said a really remarkable thing to me, a life-changing thing to me. He looked up first to see if I was serious, and he saw that I was both serious and exhausted. And he said to me, the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest.
Hmm.
And I said, out of my exhaustion, I said, the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest. What is it then? He said, the antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness.
Hmm.
You're doing all this work through your peripheral will, and it's because you're afraid of turning towards this living flame. It's time for you to go. You're ripening on the vine, and you'll rot on the vine if you don't actually get harvested. It's time for you to actually step out and to do what you want to do wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Hmm.
So that was very, very, very powerful moment.
How,
Great
how
help
does
from.
how does a
Yeah,
person know if the invitation is to stay at what one is doing, but to cultivate wholeheartedness, or to stop what one is doing and to
yeah.
do something else?
Well, it's really interesting. We have lots of theological literature about making promises, but we've got very little in any tradition about breaking promises. The Jewish tradition has a powerful ritual in the new year of breaking old promises, but that's the only one I know of. And but when you think about it, we're meant to break promises that are out of season as much as we're meant to make them. And I'm thinking, for instance, we have such pejorative associations with breaking promises. But when you think about it, the promise you make over the cradle of a newborn child is often one of complete and utter protection, whether you're the mother or the father, or you're the godfather or godmother, or you're just a relative or an uncle. Often, if you're involved with the child, it's all about protection. And that is a beautiful and necessary promise that's in the season of its time. But if you kept to that promise when they were 14 or 15 years old and offered them nothing but complete protection, you would smother their lives. Yeah. You have to go through the transition much earlier than 15, actually, 14 or 15, to let go of the promise you've made and find out what the invitation is to the new promise in the new epoch of their lives. And also the new epoch of your life. You're maturing as you go along too. So quite often, if you're feeling you need to get out of something, often what we're running into is this sense that, well, I made a promise. Yeah. I made a promise when I came into this work. I made a promise to the people I wanted to look after and support through my work. I made a promise to my future, actually, that I was going to lead. And now I don't feel any of those qualities are life-giving. Yeah.
Hmm.
So sometimes we have to turn our face away and find out, by walking away from it imaginatively and emotionally to begin with, to see where we are with it. And
Hmm.
often you'll find that if you walk away from it, but it's still part of the promise, you won't be able to actually. You'll have to turn your face back because it will be calling to you. But quite
So what they
often,
call quiet quitting is not always a bad thing.
I suppose not, as long as it doesn't go on too long. We tend to
Yeah.
take on, that can easily become another carapace where you're in limbo. You
Yeah.
find a safe place in quiet quitting. In Japan, it's a well-known cultural phenomenon they call window gazing. And someone is sidelined and they're put by a window where they can look out the window, but their work is kept away from them. And so they go into this awful imprisonment limbo of not being wanted, but not being told to go. So we can easily create that for ourselves. I wrote this piece, actually. It's called To Break a Promise. And it was written actually in my favorite sacred building in the world, which is a ruined monastic fishing cottage over the River Kong on the edge of Connemara, actually. So there's a beautiful monastic ruin there dedicated to Saint Fehn. And then over the river is a cottage on stone pillars. And there's a chimney at one end, actually, and a fireplace. But the roof is gone. But also the wall that faces downstream is gone. So if you're in there by yourself, it's a great place for contemplation because you're actually looking downstream and the river's going past you. And you're looking at everything that's already gone in a way. And in the floor, the stone floor is a slot down which the monks used to drop a net or lines to catch trout or salmon. And so you'd be in front of the fireplace, snug in this cottage 600 or 700 years ago in the 1300s, 1400s. And I've always thought it'd be a great place to catch up on the monastic gossip, if you were in there with a fellow monk. But also, if you were in there by yourself, it'd be a powerfully contemplative place, with a fire going. But in many ways, as a ruin, it's even more powerful as a magnifier of consciousness. And I was in there one winter's day, and I had the place to myself for 45 minutes, which is really, really unusual, actually, because anyone who visits the monastery loves this little place, actually, this fishing cottage, and they'll go out to it. But I was undisturbed and I was having to let go of somebody in my life. And I said, how do you let go of a promise, actually? I said, why don't you write yourself a little instruction manual, David? Because I always work in poetry on the supposition that I already know what I want to write about. At some deep core, there's a level of maturity that has occurred that the periphery of my life has not yet caught up with. So that's the part of you that's going to speak, yeah, out of the unknown. So this is the piece I wrote. It's called To Break a Promise. To break a promise, make a place of prayer. To break a promise, make a place of prayer. No fuss now. Just lean into the white brightness and say what you needed to say all along. Nothing too much. Words as simple and as yours and as heard as the bird sung above your head or the water running gently beside you. Let your words join one to another, the way stone nestles on stone, the way water just leaves and goes to the sea, the way your promise breathes and belongs with every other promise the world has ever made. Now let them go on. Let your words have their own life without you. Let the promise go with the river. Now, stand up, walk away, have faith. Now, stand up, walk away, have faith. And as I say, there was something very practical about that last line, have faith. And the faith was, well, if it's still a promise, you won't be able to walk away, actually. You'll just feel the tap on your shoulder, yeah. But at least try it, yeah. Find out in your imagination what it might be like not to be in this workplace, not to be in this imprisoning relationship, not to talk to yourself the way you talk to yourself, to get out of that unmerciful conversation you have with yourself. Yeah.
Well, and you wrote about anxiety, the answer to anxiety, which this seems to be an aspect of that, being to allow oneself to be brokenhearted, to actually let the heart break, to actually grieve whatever that promise is that's leaving, or that that loss that is being experienced.
Yeah, anxiety is the sense that you're about to have a conversation you don't want to have. Yeah. And so in order to cover over the real grief inside us, we will choose things on the outside that to take all the energies of that anxiety away from the place we actually need to go. So where as human beings, we spend an enormous amount of time trying to find a path where we won't have our heart broken. And there is no sincere path a human being can take where they will not have their heart broken. So why? Because you get your heart broken because you care about things. Yeah. So the only way of not having your heart broken is to stop caring. And as I say in my essay on care, care doesn't care if you don't want to care. We're made to care. And even angry people care about something. It's a deep level of care that has no vehicle to hold it in a generous way.
When you talk about how you assume at the start of writing poetry that you already know something that you're trying to draw out, it made me think of a poem that you wrote called "Farewell Letter," about your mother, a letter from your mother, because there's that line, you can hear motherly words of affection now only from your own mouth, and only when you speak them to those who stand motherless before you, which I think about all the time. But there's a PS at the end that says, all your intuitions were true.
Yes.
What are those intuitions about?
I think it's I'm the firstborn son of an Irish mother, so you always feel pretty special. So there's nothing else you need to do, really. When if you're bathed in that firstborn son love, which I was by my mother, it always gave me this sense of, whatever I wanted to do in life, I should just try it. And even if I just wanted to sweep the streets, then if that's what I wanted to do, I should do it. And I had that absolute permission from my mother. So in many ways, that was a reiteration of it. Yeah. But it's also my mother putting me on the back foot too. they're saying, asking me, now then, what are your intuitions? Yeah?
Hmm.
And have you neglected them? Have you kept up with them? Yeah. Are you nourishing them? Yeah? So it's all to do with the way each of us is made for the conversation of life. And will you have faith in the way you're made to hold the conversation? It's different from anyone else. Yeah.
Hmm.
You may have similarities with other people, but you hold it with a coloration and an inheritance and a body that is different than anyone else or anyone else who has ever existed.
Hmm.
So there'll never be another person holding the conversation like you to the end of time. And there never has been since the beginning of time. So
Hmm.
that's a privilege in itself, just to wake up into your own way of being in the world. Even if you spend a lot of your time falling flat on your face, it may be that's your way of holding the conversation. Yeah. There was a great story from the early Buddhist texts in the Pali texts when Buddha had a very quickly after he got out up from under the Bodhi tree and in his enlightened state and started walking around, he immediately attracted, as charismatic people do, a body of people, yeah, and followers. And so he would talk every day, and like every congregation, there's the people at the front, sitting upright. In his case, cross-legged with great posture, and like every congregation, there'd be the hooligan element at the back. In the west of Ireland, it's all the local men, usually gathered in the narthex of the church. They don't actually step into the church, but you can't say they didn't go. Yeah, and they're half listening from the back. Yeah, and so one of these fellas at the back, says, "Listen, Buddha, I've plucked up courage to ask you this, but we listen to you, but then we go out drinking and carousing, have a great time, and I usually literally fall down every evening. But spiritually, I fall down. I get so inspired by what you say, but then I go away and I fall down. Do you have any advice?" And Buddha said, "Yes, I've got the perfect advice." And the man said, "What is it, Buddha?" And he said, "Just fall in the right direction. Yeah. Fall
Hmm.
towards what you want," he said. That's your way at the moment, of holding the conversation. So just make sure you fall towards the the path you want, and not off it. Yeah. So beautiful, compassionate advice. Just wherever you are, if you're sincere, if you're paying attention, it's the only place you can step, actually. As I say in another piece, start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing close in, the step you don't want to take. Uh, Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing close in, the step you don't want to take.
I've always wanted to ask you, since a poem that you have about a conversation around the fire with an old friend. Did William Blake really see those angels?
I think he did, actually. Yes. Yeah.
Hmm.
I think he did. Yeah. And that's from the Elegy for Michael, right? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think about that poem a lot because you talked about. I'm trying to think of how you worded it, but you talked about longing for a future in which our past together is still alive. And I think
Yeah.
about that often with people who aren't, they're not separated by death, so they're not
Yeah.
grieving, but they're separated by broken relationships and broken friendships and that need for a forgiveness that just doesn't seem to be
Yes.
there.
Yes. So, well, sorry, Russell, what was your question out of that?
Well, I wonder if those two things are close together in your mind. The sense of hoping for a future where the past is still alive with someone who's gone on in death, and for that
Oh,
sense of
yes, I
someone
think,
still
yeah,
here. But
yeah, the conversations carry on and the relationship matures beyond death. I lost my good theological and poetic brother in arms, John O'Donoghue,
mm,
getting on for 15 years ago now. And 16 years ago, and I still have conversations with him. Often before I go on stage, or if I'm in a threshold of life where I feel like I don't quite know what's going on, I might talk to my mother, or I might talk to John. And my relationship with John has matured way beyond what it was. We knew each other for 16 or 17 years. And it's really quite remarkable, really. So I'm just about to do a 3 Sunday series on which is called Moving Beyond the Power of Now. And it's looking at the way all the work on now, Eckhart Tolle and Be Here Now, Ram Dass, it's all been very helpful to people, but also there's a legacy out of it where people now just have another thing to feel badly about, that I'm not living in the now.
Mm.
And actually, you're not living in the now because you don't get to choose between past, present, and future. We're a conversation between all three of them. And the past actually gets transformed by the depth of attention with which you're present now, as does your future. So we all know the way that our past can look completely different when we mature,
Mm.
and we understand what was actually occurring at that time, or we look back with more compassion than we did previously.
Mm.
So, and I always feel you get the future that you deserve in many ways, or that you feel you deserve. If you don't feel you deserve your happiness, then you'll be looking for something else. So part of the deserving is paying attention in such a way that the world can come and find you.
Mm.
And speaking of William Blake, this is what he called innocence. He says songs of innocence and experience. But to Blake, innocence was not a commodity which would be replaced by experience. Innocence is your ability to be found by the world again and again in increasingly more radical ways.
Mm. Except as one become like a little child, one cannot see the kingdom of heaven.
Exactly.
Yeah. I wonder as we go if you could read or recite, because I know you have so much in memory. Your poem that I love so much, "The True Love."
Yes. Yeah. This is a piece that came out of working with a group of Catholic sisters. It was myself and 144 sisters for 3 days
Hmm.
together. And they wanted me to work with the theme of Peter stepping out of the boat. And so I went down with my heart in my hands because I thought this is going to be quite something. It's a radical image, and then myself and 145 sisters together for 3 days. Yeah. So, but this is a piece that I wrote out of it, and it's been used actually at hundreds of marriages. There's an image also in the poem from my marine zoology studies out in the Hebrides, in the Western Isles of Scotland. And there's an old form of Celtic Christianity there where they had prayers for every part of the day. The older people, they'd have a prayer for opening their eyes in the morning, a prayer for opening the curtains, letting the light into the house. They'd have a prayer for unsmooring the fire and getting it going again. They'd have a prayer for going out the door. And right in front of our residence at the marine biology station where we stayed, there was an older man came down every morning to the quay, the stone quay, where his fishing boat was. And I used to watch him while I was drinking my morning coffee. And he'd always take his hat off, press it to his chest, and say his prayer into the boat and into the waters of the sea. He'd turn to the boat and then he'd turn to the sea. And he'd be praying for the longest time before he touched an item of his gear. And I remember saying to myself, I have no equivalent of that in my life. But what would it look like if I did have it? So he appears in the poem, but this is the true love. There's a faith in loving fiercely the one who is rightfully yours. There's a faith in loving fiercely the one who is rightfully yours, the work that is rightfully yours, the life that is rightfully yours. There's a faith in loving fiercely the one who is rightfully yours, especially if you have waited years, and especially if you never believed you could deserve this loved and beckoning hand held out to you this way. I'm thinking of faith now and the testaments of loneliness and what we feel we are worthy of in this world. Years ago in the Hebrides, I remember an old man who walked every day on the grey stones to the shore of baying seals, who would press his hat to his chest in the blustering salt wind and say his prayer to the turbulent Jesus hidden in the water. And I think of the story of the storm and everyone waking and seeing the distant yet familiar figure far across the water calling to them, and how we're all waiting for that abrupt waking and that calling and that moment we have to say yes, except it will not come so grandly, so biblically, but more subtly and intimately in the face of the one you know you have to love. So that when we finally step out of the boat towards them, we find everything holds us and everything sustains our courage. And if you wanted to drown, you could. If you wanted to drown, you could drown, but you don't. You don't, because finally, after all this struggle and all these years, you simply don't want to anymore. You don't want to anymore. You've simply had enough of drowning, and you want to live and you want to love, and you will walk across any territory, however fluid and however dangerous, to take the one hand you know belongs in yours.
David Whyte. The book is Consolations 2, The Solace, Nourishment, and Underlying Meaning of Everyday Words. Thank you for your poetry and what it has meant to me over the years and continues to mean, and for your writing. And thank you for this conversation today.
Thank you, Russell. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, you're a pleasure to speak with. Thank you.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Will Dawson. The associate producer is Mackenzie Hill. This episode was mixed by Kevin Morris with video production by Abby Egan. Theme music by Lennon Hutton. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.